Welcome to the Gems of Google Earth, a series where I uncover some of the most fascinating and oftentimes overlooked satellite images and the stories they tell. In this video, we're going to explore Northeast Asia. Let's start off with a place that I am going to terribly mispronounce, the Takamakan Desert. It's spelled Taklamakan when you Romanize it. Now, the name itself isn't particularly important. What's more important is just the stunning image it creates on the map, and even more stunning images that it creates when you're actually there, which I have unfortunately never had the experience of being in. This is a pretty mysterious desert, as it's really in one of the farthest corners of what is now China, in northwestern China specifically. And it is utterly gigantic, being well over 300,000 square kilometers, or if you're using Murica units, well over 100,000 square miles. It's roughly the size of France and is one of the largest deserts in Asia. And I don't mean those typical deserts with some cacti here and there. I mean endless sand dunes. What's quite remarkable about this is that this desert is pretty much surrounded by a series of mountains, and all the sand dunes pretty much clump on top of each other in between this mountain range. Now, amongst this vast desert, you do see various oases, and this has provided little pit stops that date back as far as the Silk Road, tying well into the interior of Central Asia and eventually Iran, the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. Now, today it's not particularly that important. After all, its climate is pretty terrible, ranging from plus 40 degrees Celsius to lower than negative 20. And it is an excellent place if you want to die, unless you're a two-humped camel. But nonetheless, it has shaped the sort of, let's just say, beginnings of globalization, given its importance during the days of the Silk Road. Today, one of the most iconic figures is the aforementioned Bactrian camel, but you also have a couple other very tough and ready creatures like a variety of insects, reptiles, and desert foxes. After all, only the toughest of the tough can exist here. However, there aren't really too many human settlements. Even the native Uyghur people by and large live on the outskirts of this desert, and this area by and large is untouched by human settlement for the most part. Next on the list is a place with a lot more water, and these are the Chinese man-made islands in the South China Sea. Since around the early 2010s, China has been building artificial islands nearby the Spratly Islands in what is now called the South China Sea. Now, this area already had fairly shallow water, a lot of coral reefs, and even some quasi-atolls, or at least cays. And this has been used to build up military outposts. By dredging up sand and coral, they could create new islands, but this has come at the cost of a great deal of environmental destruction, and on top of that, it has deeply angered a lot of the surrounding countries, such as Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. The reason for this is that China is pretty much trying to extend its maritime territory, if you could even call maritime territory, since maritime means water and territory means land, but you get my point. They're trying to expand their borders. This, by and large, has pulled many of China's neighbors into the sphere of the pro-Western or pro-Japanese camp in a way to thwart China. However, it's still too early to tell what the geopolitical ramifications of these islands will be. Next on the list is the Demilitarized Zone. Yeah, we're still sticking to contentious geopolitical issues here. This is the buffer zone that separates North and South Korea. Now, North and South Korea are technically still at war, since the Korean War ended not with a peace treaty, but rather with a ceasefire. During the 1950s, there was an armistice agreement in which these two countries basically set upon a giant buffer state. a buffer state that is called the Demilitarized Zone despite being quite possibly the most militarized zone on the planet, given the large number of military fortifications and the heavy use of landmines. What's quite interesting is that if you actually look at some of these images, it doesn't look like some war-torn place. However, it was in the past and it might be in the future, although hopefully not. In honor of any potential weebs watching this video, I gotta reference a few places in Japan. This next area translates into English to Hell Valley Wild Monkey Park. Now, when you typically think of monkeys and you think of the places they live, you'd think of, say, tropical rainforests, jungles in perhaps South America or Central Africa, Southeast Asia. You wouldn't typically associate monkeys with a temperate country like Japan, a country that has fairly cool weather. But nonetheless, there are some monkeys that actually like the cold weather. Out of all the animals in the animal kingdom, I would say that these monkeys probably live the lives most similar to, let's just say, modern developed human retirees. Just chilling, eating, enjoying the good life. And you wouldn't even notice it by looking at this picture, which by and large just looks like any sort of cold weather climate with some boreal forest here and there. So let's move on to one area that you're almost certainly aware of, and that's the Great Wall of China. Now, initially, I didn't want to include the Great Wall of China on this list because, let's keep it real, everybody has heard of it. But the reason why I included it on this list, despite it already being fairly well known, well, extremely well known, is because the Great Wall of China isn't actually on the Chinese-Mongolian border. As many of you already know, the Great Wall was meant to protect China from the Mongol invasion. But alas, if you look at modern borders, the Great Wall of China is actually very close to the capital city of Beijing, not the actual border of Mongolia. This is primarily because the modern nation state of Mongolia is quite different than the sort of ethnic outlook and areas of which Mongolians live in. There is Inner Mongolia in China, which is composed of much of the northern stretch of the country, of which there was once inhabited by Mongols who were hostile to various Chinese dynasties. Eventually, many of them would coalesce into the modern People's Republic of China, dominated by Han Chinese. But during the Middle Ages, this just wasn't the case. What these images show is that there is a great deal of divergence between what borders existed in the past that were oftentimes loose and based off of ethnicity or linguistics, and what borders exist today in the present, primarily based off of state administration. Next on the list are the TSMC fabs and by and large industrial districts of Taiwan. Now, a TSMC fab is essentially a high-tech manufacturing facility. Now, the reason why Taiwan exists as a quasi-nation is because the nationalists of China had, at one point during 1911, overthrown the entire Chinese dynastic system, but they faced various challenges. One, the threat of the Japanese during World War II, and two, the threat of the Chinese Communist Party led by Mao. Eventually, the nationalists and the communists teamed up to defeat the Japanese, but the moment the Japanese were gone, they had their civil war. The Americans supported the nationalists, and the Soviets in Moscow helped support the communists, and the communists had won. The nationalists had fled to Taiwan. Initially, Taiwan was a nationalist authoritarian state that was by and large favored by the international community, but as mainland China grew in economic and political power and influence, it eventually took hold more on the global stage. Today, both countries claim to be the one true China, and both claim to kind of rule each other, even though they don't. In order to protect itself and ensure American defense security, the nation of Taiwan, also known as the Republic of China, not only democratized, but also invested a great deal in the manufacturing of microchips. They allowed the Americans to dominate the scene of the design of microchips and information technology. However, they would master the manufacturing. By making one of the most important resources and industries in the world in the hands of the Taiwanese would then eventually make sure that the Americans would come to their aid under the threat of a Chinese invasion. This to this day is a very complicated issue, and whether or not mainland China invades Taiwan is still up for debate. But nonetheless, a lot of these fabs, while not particularly amusing from satellite images, will play a critical role in our geopolitical future. Next on the list is really more of a generality, and that's Japan's topography. Now, Japan is known for its beautiful vistas as seen in numerous paintings and spoken about in various haikus, but from a geographic, more pragmatic perspective, it's actually pretty terrible. The reason being is that Japan is very mountainous and lacking in many natural resources, particularly hydrocarbon resources, and that pretty much means that much of Japan has to build up very densely on what are essentially coastal plains. So, for example, the city of Tokyo is basically based upon a gigantic coastal plain surrounded by mountains, as are virtually all major Japanese cities. The rest of Japan is by and large sparsely inhabited, made up of just a few small towns and highway networks. This makes for some incredibly beautiful topography and great tourism, and maybe even some great art, but it isn't particularly good for building cities, and it's also susceptible to a great deal of seismic activity. Next on the list is the Three Gorges Dam in China. This is along the Yangtze River. This is a hydroelectric dam that is just colossally massive in scale. It's well over 2,000 meters in length and is roughly 185 meters high. Its reservoir length is over 600 kilometers, which is massive. It was built primarily for, one, producing hydroelectric power, which by and large is eco-efficient, and two, controlling floods. By and large, the dam also improves navigation along the Yangtze River as well. The construction started during the 1990s and was completed in 2012. However, the power stations didn't really come into full force until 2003. Overall, the amount of manpower used to produce this dam was just spectacular, and it is truly one of the greatest engineering feats in the world. There is even some talk of, let's just say, an attack on this dam if Taiwan were to be invaded. Perhaps the Taiwanese would try to one-up their more powerful mainland neighbor by attacking this dam, although I hope that neither of those two things happen. And speaking of Taiwan, let's go back to one of the areas that it holds, and I'm gonna again mispronounce this area, the Penghu Islands. Yes, my mispronunciation is atrocious. Now, these are a series of islands between the main island of Taiwan and mainland China. Overall, the islands by and large are pretty mellow, pretty nice for tourism, pretty beautiful, but overall not particularly important, unless you're talking about geopolitics, in which they are, as they would provide a very important jumping off point for the People's Liberation Army of mainland China to take control of the islands before engaging in a full direct assault on the main island. Now keep in mind that an amphibious invasion of Taiwan would be incredibly difficult regardless of these islands. After all, the island has a tropical climate, dense rainforest, high elevation, and would be incredibly difficult to take over through brute military force. Which is why some say that the Chinese Navy may instead choose to circulate these Penghu Islands first, choke them off, and then move on to the main island without firing a single shot. And on that depressing note, I'm going to end this video. But in my next video, I'm going to be covering the gems of Google Earth in Southeast Asia. Stay tuned.